Welcome back to China X. For those of you who are new, and I suspect many of you are new because we're now beginning what we call the modern part of the course. My name is Peter Bohl. I was teaching ancient history and middle period history and some later imperial history. And if you were here before, Mark Elliott was dealing with the Qing Empire, the Manchu Empire. And now with my colleague and friend Bill Kirby, and we've been teaching this course together for many years, and he's been the one who did the modern part. By the way, if you are new to the course and you'd like to go back and do the earlier parts, you're still able to do that. You can still get honor certificates or audit it as you please. But Bill, you and I have been doing this, and we've, I guess, for almost 20 years now, perhaps a bit more. Archidonian.
Really, but this is the moment in the course where you're always the happiest. Your part is done.
I am done. I am done. That's true, except I'm looking forward to coming back as we do some of the office hours.
That's right.
Because we do office hours based on the comments that you're making in the discussion forums, and we do want you to participate. But Bill, I'm what's sometimes called a pre-modernist, but a pre-modernist assumes there's something called modern, which we can know. And so what does modern mean? And why would you, as a modern historian, begin your story in the 18th century?
Well, it's a very good question. If you were to look at a Chinese history textbook in the People's Republic today or in Taiwan, you will find that modern history often is said to begin, say, in the Opium War. Sometimes it's said to begin after the May 4th
That's in the
movement.
1830s and 40s.
Late 1830s, early 1840s. Right. China's encounter with the West as the defining problem of modern Chinese history. Others date modern history from a later point, say 1919, and the intellectual revolution surrounding the so-called May 4th movement that we'll talk a great deal about shortly thereafter, the founding of the two great Chinese parties, the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party.
The Nationalist Party
and
the
Party,
Party.
Which have defined Chinese political life in the 20th century. I think the 18th century is a good place to start. The Qing dynasty at its height, the wealthiest, most powerful, most civilized state by almost every dimension that one can imagine by the end of the 18th century on Earth, seemingly without peer. And yet the 19th century, as we shall see, would be one of enormous challenges for the Qing and for the place we call China. And by the beginning of the 20th century, a 2,000-year imperial tradition is gone overnight, not to reappear. What happened? How do we explain it? How do we think of those issues that matter still today for China? So what does modern mean? Modern means of the present time, some relationship to the present time. And so when one thinks about it, one way of deciding when modern history begins, European historians often begin it in 1789 with the French Revolution, the end of the Ancien Régime and so on. Well, I like what John Fairbank used to say. It really does start in the 18th century, a century in which you can see the foundation of many of the issues, the permanent issues that China faces as it moves from empire to nation state over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. So population growth.
Sure.
The enormous expansion of China's population in the course of the period of peace and prosperity of the 18th century, and we'll talk about that. The physical landmass that is China today. China becomes the empire that we know today largely in the 18th century.
Yeah, that's right, when the Qianlong Emperor is out there with these campaigns in the West, bringing the Dzungars and the Uyghurs into line.
So Xinjiang and Tibet are brought into the empire in this period of time, and it's been both it's been a challenge for modern Chinese states, but one that they have consistently met of holding on to both domestic and international claims to this territory as part of modern China.
And of course that gives them a population that's multi-ethnic and that can have real tensions.
That's right. That's right. The question of unity and how to maintain unity. Unity, as you talked about in the past, a historic goal, of course, for every dynasty, but an elusive one.
Well, it's not constant.
It's absolutely not constant. If you all recall, and those of you who are new, go back to one of our first modules to see this map of the...
Oh yes, go to the very first module, in fact, right?
To see the map of how China grows and shrinks over time.
Right. Bill, you're beginning in part 7 with, the title of this part is called Invasions, Rebellions, and the End of Imperial China.
Right.
What's that all about?
In the 18th and 19th century, you have a powerful and still successful empire of the Qing, still expanding its power and its sway and its geographic territory into the far west. So that empire is growing as a land empire, and yet it begins a new set of encounters with a place that we call, in too simple a set of terms, the West. In the 19th century, an encounter of this great empire with a new, highly mobile, militarized, industrialized empire, that of Great Britain in particular, for which there is, in effect, no preparation. And it challenges the very foundations of legitimacy for the Qing state, and is one of the factors that will bring imperial China to a close by the early 20th century.
So this is a very different kind of encounter from that took place in the 16th century, when the Jesuits go and the Portuguese and Spanish traders end up going to China, and China starts to import all this silver. This is a really different kind of experience of the West, isn't it?
And for this state, it's a very negative one.
Very much.
Because it challenges all of the pillars of imperial rule. And at the same time, we have to look at the modern Chinese economy begins to become even more international. The modern Chinese economy, as we know it today, has its roots also in this period of private enterprises, of private industrial enterprises, of Sino-foreign enterprise. China changes internally, not simply because Western values are forced upon it, but Chinese leaders, educational leaders as well as political leaders, as well as economic leaders, choose among a global menu of options as to where they will go. And of course, historically Chinese options.
That's going to be very much sort of a part of the 20th century story of China and its resurgence. But at this point, you're talking about some fairly unhappy events. I mean, there are other kinds of private enterprise here too. Opium.
Yes, yes.
That's private enterprise. The spread of Christian missionaries and Christian ideas.
Right.
Private enterprise as well.
Of a sort.
Of a sort. But backed certainly by foreign powers.
These Western powers are weakening the great Qing Empire, humiliating it. They are, as would be said of a later period of time, they are a disease of the skin. The Taiping Rebellion to the great Qing Empire is a disease of the heart. This enormous mid-century rebellion that is a self-styled Chinese Christian rebellion, nearly topples the Qing, leads to the death of tens of millions of Chinese. The greatest civil war of the 19th century. The greatest war of the 19th century takes place in China. With, at the time, it seems the future of Chinese civilization at stake. The question of economic development and economic growth. The biggest economy in the world in 1820 was that of the Qing Empire. By 2020, the biggest economy in the world will be China's. Almost without question.
And the
richest people in the world in 1820 were Chinese.
And the biggest economy in 1600 and in 1200.
No. So that's the norm.
Yeah,
the period that we will be talking about that isn't the norm is the 19th century.
The period where you're beginning.
In some sense. Not quite, because we'll begin in the 18th century. Also, international competition. This is an issue that, of course, matters enormously for China today and its place in the world. And the period that we are discussing here, beginning in the late 18th century, is one, and particularly in the first part of the 19th century, one of suddenly intense international competition in which the very survival of China as a state and as a civilization is at stake. So these are issues that have their roots, let's put it this way, in the 18th century, certainly by the late 18th century.
And I would push it further and say lots of them have their roots even going back into earlier periods as well, which I think helps explain why we, in fact, are doing all of Chinese history together in this long course, and why this works, because so much of this is...
Right. There are many universities that divide up. You do pre-modern China in one semester, you do modern China in another, and we've always linked them in part because the ways in which the issues of modern China are discussed in China itself are always with some historical resonance.
Right.
What is the role of Confucianism in China today? It matters enormously.
It turns out to be a big issue again in China. The role of education.
Right.
the role of examinations. I thought, when we finished the scholars and said everything was corrupt and it was falling apart, it was, but if we look at what's called the Gaokao, the university entrance examination today, it's one of the most important events in the lives of many middle school students.
The old imperial exams that Peter has talked about in earlier lectures, the one beginning in a serious, consistent way in Song times, they go all the way till 1905, and one day to the next they're gone. And yet they are reinvented in a different way.
That's right.
A new version of what a wonderful Japanese historian has once called China's examination hell still faces every Chinese family that seeks to go on to higher education.
So you're going to go on right into the very present, right? So we're going to be this
into
is
the
going
future, in fact,
into the future too.
Yes.
Well, because you're going to ask that question: can China lead?
That's right.
And that's a future question.
That is a question for the future. China, when we take over this course right now, and as I begin my part of this course, China is in the lead. The Qing dynasty is in the lead.
Right.
Arguably, it loses that lead, but it doesn't. China adapts and survives the period of European and Western imperialism, perhaps better than any other part of the world, and as a remarkably fast comeback over the course
Relatively
of the
speaking. Yeah.
Relatively speaking, over the course of the 20th century. And the question now for our 21st century is, will China lead the 21st century? That is a question that we will try to answer in our very last module. But before then, we have many
more things to do.
To discuss.
Well, yes. I was about to say, I look forward to seeing your modules.
I look forward to sharing them.
We look forward to seeing you on China X.